Good morning and welcome to Disrupting the Pipeline, Advancing Racial Equity in Schools. We're so excited that you're joining us for the North Carolina Conference for Educational Equity, brought to you by the Friday Institute. I'm Emmy Coleman, a research associate at the Friday Institute, and I'm going to be your session host today. For the North Carolina Conference for Educational Equity, brought to you by the Friday Institute. I'm Emmy Coleman, a research associate at the Friday Institute, and I'm going to be your session host today. During the session, I'll be monitoring the chat for comments, questions, and any technical assistance that you might need. So please don't hesitate to use the chat at any time you need the support. During the session, I'll be monitoring the chat for comments, questions, and any technical assistance that you might need. So please don't hesitate to use the chat at any time you need the support. At this time, we would like to welcome Dr. Daniel Bullock and Jermaine Porter.
Hello, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Emmy, for introducing us. My name is Dr. Daniel Kelvin Bullock, and I am the Executive Director for Equity Affairs for Durham Public Schools. Extremely excited to be here with you this morning. And here with me, I have Mr. Jermaine Porter, our Boys of Color Initiative Coordinator. And I'm actually going to, feel free to follow us on Twitter at DPS_equity and at Jermaine L. Porter. And at this time, I'm going to yield to Mr. Porter and he will get us started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bullock, and thank you for everyone who's attending. First, I'd like to take a trip to North Carolina A&T State University's Student Union and go to a vending machine. And I'd like to give you a tale of $2. So what I want to do is, I want you to look at both of these and understand that the value of the dollars are the same. The one in this hand is worth $1, and the one in this hand is $1. So if I take this particular dollar and I ball this dollar up, and I throw this dollar on the ground and I spit on it and I say, dollar, you will never be anything. You come from a place that isn't supposed to learn. So I ask you, what is the value of this dollar? It's $1. What is the value of the dollar that's been balled up? It is still $1. So now what I want you to do is I want you to tell me, if you're going to the vending machine, which dollar you're willing to give the opportunity and the access to get what you want. Most people are going to choose a dollar that is crisp, the dollar that hasn't been through anything. And they're going to put this dollar into the vending machine. And when they put this dollar into the vending machine, if it shoots back out, and when it shoots back out, you look at it and you say, dollar, I don't know what the problem is. You look at it and you feel like, oh, it's just a corner. So what you do is you just rub the corner out. And then you decide, I'm going to put it back into the vending machine. but it comes back out again. Now, mind you, you have another dollar, but you choose not to use this particular dollar because this particular dollar doesn't look like it's going to get you what you want. So you don't have the opportunity. So what you decide to do is you say, I don't want to give this dollar that opportunity. But this is where the equity work comes into place, because this is when you decide you might have to actually go and unravel that dollar. And you might have to actually do a little bit more work. And when you're doing that, I want you to assume that this is just like our students. Oftentimes, our students come to us balled up. Our students, after COVID-19 and after the protests, are going to come to our classroom, be it or be it virtually. And we have to be able to give all students the same opportunity. The same opportunity you were willing to give to the dollar that hasn't been through anything should be given to the same dollar bill that had been balled up and put on the ground. And that's the same thing that's happened to you. Many of us would not be on this call today had someone not seen us as that wrinkled dollar bill, had not decided to unravel us and build relationships with us to make us who we are today as we continue to grow. That's what equity is all about, giving all of our students, no matter where they come from, the same opportunity and the same access.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Porter. We're going to, and thank you for starting us off with that awesome analogy regarding the tale of the $2 bills. This morning, we have 3 primary objectives that we will be following. We're going to review evidence supporting the ongoing need to address issues of equity in North Carolina public schools. We're going to reflect on bias and how it manifests in schools, particularly in terms of discipline practices. And we're also going to consider ways of creating culturally inclusive schools through relationship building and equity. So we hope that you all are ready to join us on this journey this morning. Now, as we engage in these conversations, there will be some times where we ask people to communicate with us via the chat. And so that we have a few norms that we'd like to utilize when we do this. Our norms for today are that we be respectful as we communicate in the chat, that we allow constructive friction, meaning that as we're talking about some of these issues as it relates to equity, as it relates to discipline practices, there can be some friction in those conversations. And that's totally fine, as long as that friction is constructive and we're using it to build a better understanding of how we might better serve our students. We also ask that we assume the best and we assume love in what people have to say, but we're also being mindful and thoughtful about the impact of our words. We want us to speak our truth and also be present and engage in the conversation. Another quick note is that we ask that people have some sort of a device or resource for note taking. So that could be through Google Docs, that could be an actual pen and paper, something where you can kind of think through some of the thoughts as we engage in some of our conversations via chat. So hopefully we're all on board for these norms and we will move forward with our presentation. So Mr. Porter, if you can talk to us a little bit about where our journey begins. And we apologize, there were some delays. We're navigating delays between our presentation and what's actually being shown in YouTube. But from here on, we're gonna just continue rolling and hopefully there won't be any lapses in audio or anything. So back to you, Mr. Porter.
Thank you so much. And I do apologize for the delays. but it's important that we understand where our journey begins. And for North Carolina, it begins with our students. And I think it's important for us to understand what demographics look like when it comes to race here in North Carolina, where we have over 47% of our students in North Carolina are white, while we have 25% of our students are Black, 18.5% are Hispanic, and then we also have multiracial students at 4.5%. So in thinking about demographics, in our chat, we're going to be using the chat today. I want you to consider the demographics of your school and your district. Then I want you to share in the chat, do the demographics matter? Why or why not? Right? And this is for you. So some of you might be like, well, I think the demographics matter, but I don't think my district feels that way. But this is coming from you and how you feel in reference to, do demographics matter? Why or why not? So if you would, please share with us in the chat that information. Thank you so much, Queen Pfeiffer, in reference to saying that it does matter. You have to get to know your students. Relationships are very important. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have several people saying absolutely, it does matter. You guys are rocking and rolling, and I appreciate that. Jeremy is saying you need to understand the background of your students. Thank you, Jeremy. Ms. Ray says you need to understand diversity is the root. Leanne O'Neill, of course. Ms. Maxwell saying you need to know the students that you're actually serving. Yes, they matter. It builds relationships. Thank you so much, Maria. Austin said need diversity to help with perspective. Someone says it helps with knowing the needs. Thank you guys so much. So a lot of you are saying, echoing the same things, saying, yes, you believe that demographics matter. So now what we want to do is we want to go and look at the North Carolina percentage of students scoring proficient on the ELG and EOC exams from 2019. What I'll ask you to do now is look at this particular chart and tell me what it is that you see. You can put into the chat, when you look at this particular chart, tell me what you observe whenever you analyze this particular data set. Brandy says half of North Carolina is failing. Ms. Thompson says Black students are the lowest. Nicole, gross inequities. Non-white majority. We don't know how to reach all students. Minority groups are lower. There are bias in testing. Someone went to the demographics and noticed they said the lowest percentage of our demographics are our highest performing set of students in the state. Awesome. So now what we want to do is we want to compare and look at our demographics and our short-term suspensions. So we looked at our demographics and we looked at our EOC, EOG proficiency. Now we want to go and look at where we are in reference to our demographics and our suspension demographics, right? And then for this particular data set, you'll see that where Blacks are only 25% of the demographics, they make up 54% of short-term suspension. Students of color make up right at 65% of short-term suspensions, but only make up less than 40% of the total demographics in our state. Take a moment at this time and tell me, what does that say about North Carolina and our suspension rates? And then I'm going to give you a perspective that you might not have actually heard of before or thought about, and that is how what we're doing is criminalizing normal adolescent behavior. And we're going to talk about the echoes of the criminal justice system in North Carolina schools when it comes down to suspensions.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to insert here as we're considering this is when you look at, we asked the question about, do the demographics matter? And one of the things to consider, because some people might argue, well, the demographics do not matter. But one of the things that we see is that the demographics tend to matter in terms of outcomes. So if we're looking at how well students fare on end of grade or end of course tests, the demographics matter in terms of who's being successful and who's not. If we're talking about who's being suspended from school, the demographics tend to matter in who's being suspended and who's not. So we really want people to understand that the demographics do matter, because there are disparities or differences in outcomes depending on how students identify. And so we're looking at racial data right now. You could have a similar conversation around socioeconomic status, but we have seen in data that race is a primary predictor of outcomes in our school system and across systems, really.
Yeah, correct. Dr. Bullock, to echo what you were saying, it does go across all systems, right? Not just education. So when you look at disproportionalities, it isn't just in education where you see disproportionalities in discipline. You can also go and you see disproportionalities in academics. You can go look at our criminal justice system, our healthcare systems. Oftentimes when I tell educators, our system isn't failing us. It is getting the results it was intended to receive. So now when we talk about the criminalization of normative adolescent behavior, all right, so we look at the first one, and when we talk about whenever we're going to put in North Carolina, if a student does something in your school and you're an administrator, and the student has done an act, Whenever you go and put it into your system, odds are you're putting that student in, not as a student, but you're putting them in as an offender, right? And that is what it is in the criminal justice system. So now let's take pushing and shoving. Pushing and shoving in school is now considered assault. And it could be who is doing the pushing and the shoving that is going to be considered the assault. Stealing a cell phone, right? Now we're going to criminalize the student, and that's going to be considered theft or robbery. So talking back and the use of profanity. I was a school administrator, and there've been times when students would talk back or students get upset and students are going down the hallway and they're fussing and they're cussing. And now it is, we're going to get that student and they're going to be charged with disorderly conduct. So what we're doing for regular adolescent behavior is we're criminalizing it simply because oftentimes we don't have the relationships with our students. So we want to go ahead and say, you know what? You stole the phone. Not why did you steal the phone? Let's get to the root of that. But we're going to go ahead and say, you know what? Let's charge this student with theft or robbery, which leads us to the echoes of the criminal justice system, period, within schools and our criminal justice system. So as we go through this, excuse me, you have the act, which equals a violation. So we'll go through this as a student did something in a class. So once a student did something in class or in the hallway, who do they go and see? They go and see the principal or the assistant principal. And this is where they tell their story as to what happened, similar to a trial. And then they're telling it to a judge who will be the principal or the assistant principal. The judge then gives a sentence. Principals, assistant principals, they give the punishment. That could also be considered a sentence. It doesn't matter if it's 3 days of OSS, 2 days of ISS. However, and then during that, they're serving time. When the student is out of the classroom, because of the discipline issue, they're serving time. Just like in the criminal justice system, if we take someone out of society and we incarcerate them, what are they doing? They're serving time. So we suspend our students or put them in alternative schools. And then sometimes our alternative schools, the way they're set up, are set up like prisons. And then we get to reentry. It is important for all schools and school districts to have a reentry plan for when you suspend students. I'll say that again. It is important for you to have a reentry plan whenever we suspend our students. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is recidivism. That same teacher that they cussed out and they were suspended for several days, you want to put them right back into the exact same classroom without having a conversation with them? That makes no sense. It's the same thing with the criminal justice system. We expect criminals to just come out after they serve their time. We want to allow them to come back into society without any issues. If you looked at the documentary When They See Us, you see whenever one of them got out, what he did was he went back to what he was used to. That is what our students do. Their friends kept living while they were suspended. Classes kept going. So when they come back into the classroom and they're already further behind, what do they want to do? They want to go somewhere or they want to do something that they're comfortable with. But if we don't provide a reentry plan for our students who we are suspending, all we're going to do is increase the recidivism of those students, and our suspension rates are going to increase.
So thank you, Mr. Porter, for that. And we want to, from this point, we want to think about our data and challenging deficit mindsets, because immediately, once we have a conversation about data, we have to immediately start to challenge the mindsets that often accompany that data. Because what we will do is we'll look at the data, we'll look at the disparities, and our biases will start to explain away the data. And we look at it and we see that, well, Black students are getting suspended more for these offenses more so than white students. So we rationalize it and we say, well, Black students must be doing things to be more deserving of these punishments than white students are. But, and I noticed in the chat earlier, someone mentioned subjectivity, how a lot of these offenses can be very subjective. It can depend on the adult who witnessed the behavior, how they chose to handle it. And there can be biases in who we're more offended by when students commit certain offenses, and who we're less offended by. And so one of the things we've done and that we're going to challenge you all to do is that when we look at the data and we see is for an offense like disrespect or disruptive behavior, you have to start to peel back the reasoning for writing the student up or wanting the student suspended for certain offenses, because we may find that what was perceived as disrespect by one adult would not have been perceived as disrespect by another, and there could be a cultural bias connected to it. So that's just one example. So we have to know our data, not only our numerical data, but also our qualitative data, the stories that our students and our families are telling us. And then we have to start understanding implicit bias and the role that it plays in all of this. So on your screen here, you see a definition from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And they define implicit bias as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which can be both favorable or unfavorable, are activated involuntarily and without our awareness or intentional control. So one of the things that I like to tell people is that we all have these biases. We all have to be mindful about, one, acknowledging that we have them, and then doing the work to unpack them and hopefully minimizing them in their impact in our work as educators. So we asked you earlier to pull out like a Google Doc or a sheet of paper. We'd like for you to take a moment to just record examples of bias that you have seen in schools, both favorable biases and unfavorable biases. So sometimes we think that if we have a favorable bias towards a student or a group of students, then that's a positive thing and it's nothing that we really need to challenge. However, when we have either of these types of biases, there can be some issues that accompany that. For example, if we have a bias that says that a certain group of students, AIG, let's say students who are identified as academically or intellectually gifted, we may have heard a comment in our schools that say, well, this teacher is out today, but that's the AIG class, so they'll be fine. No. We need to get an adult in there to monitor those students. If a teacher is out, all students need to be monitored. Sometimes your AIG students more than other students. All right, but that's a favorable bias that we tend to have towards that group. The idea that they're going to be better behaved, that they can manage themselves, etc. That's an example of a favorable bias towards that group. So what I'd like for you to do is just kind of jot down some ideas to yourself of examples of words or actions from teachers, students, parents, or administrators that you've heard, examples of favorable implicit bias towards a group of students, or examples of unfavorable implicit bias towards students. So just sharing in the chat, I'd like for you to jot some notes down, but also share in the chat. These are examples of bias that I have actually heard or experienced myself. So let's take a few moments. I will be monitoring the chat and we're going to share out on some of those. And then we're also going to have a moment after this to think about how have we responded? And when we get to that idea of response, if you haven't responded in that moment, if you were frustrated, you didn't feel like dealing with it, that'll be fine. So we will want to think about how we respond, but first we want to acknowledge some of the things we've seen and heard in school. So I'll give you a couple of minutes for that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing just some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat and some themes that I'm seeing. So, for example, one of the reasons we have this conversation about deficit mindsets is because, again, our biases would lead us to believe that any disparities we see in schools are due to deficiencies either in students of color, their families, their homes, their communities, etc. And when we explain away the disparities in that manner, it gives us less ownership over the role that we might play in the disparities. So if we have no ownership over any of the disparities, we have no reason to change some of our practices. And I see people echoing that in the chat. For example, I see someone who said these parents just don't care. And even the notion of students with disabilities not belonging in certain schools. These kids do not want to learn. And so if those types of things are being shared or communicated, one, it's important for us to have some tools or strategies to respond, because these are kind of pervasive ideas that, you know, if students aren't experiencing success in our schools, it's their fault, it's their family's fault, it's their community's fault. Meanwhile, going back to what Mr. Porter was saying earlier, there's so much in our education system founded upon the idea, one, that Blacks are intellectually inferior to whites, or the Latinx community isn't as prepared to be successful in schools as other communities are. And that's why those disparities look the way they do in those charts that we shared earlier. So as we continue in the chat, I'd like for you to reflect and share in the chat, how have you typically navigated comments like that? You know, when people talk about the kids not caring, the families not caring, you know, this idea that Black kids don't want to be successful. They don't want to get good grades. They don't want to achieve at high levels. How have we responded to that? How have we typically navigated those types of comments? Because the reality is, it could be very easy to just throw up our hands and, you know, say, well, you know, that person isn't going to change. Just shake our heads and walk away. So how have you typically navigated those comments, and what might be some healthy ways of responding to ideas like that?
Dr. Bullock, if I could add.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I would also like to know, do you feel as though you're prepared to actually have that conversation? Right? Do you feel as though you're actually prepared, or you've received resources to have that conversation? Because some people who might be saying these comments, if you don't have a relationship with them, you may come off to them a certain way and cause friction where you are. So I would like to know if you feel as though you are able to have those conversations, as well as how do you typically do that, and what might be some ways, healthy ways in responding.
Yeah, and I mean, if y'all just read through the chat, and we've done this presentation a few times, and it never ceases to amaze us, like some of the things that we share. Like, and if we know we're hearing those things, like what is the impact of these types of statements and actions on students? Like their motivation, their dedication, or even accepting the notion that this education system is built for them, if they're having to navigate these types of things. A couple of examples that are not here, but we've heard in sessions before, is getting to the discipline thing and thinking about SROs. You know, we had an administrator share in one of our sessions that they had heard an SRO say, I can't wait till that kid turns 18 so they can arrest them. And so the administrator who was in that session talked about how he went about responding to that and challenging that and getting the officer to think, you know, think through what he was saying a little more. But if we are in schools just waiting for kids to exhibit certain behaviors so we can get them, and students feel like just their presence in our schools is a problem, that's not a healthy place to be. And that's not a healthy environment in which we can learn.
Yeah, to echo what you were saying, Dr. Bullock, about these are the people who are making these comments they're actually teaching our students, right? So we would hope that these teachers have the best interest of our students, but oftentimes those biases are the reasons why some students can't make it through the first part of class, because the teacher might feel, I have a great lesson today, and I definitely don't want to deal with this student because of what may have happened yesterday. So they call the administrator, same conference we were at presenting with the administrators, we discussed with them how teachers already know the students that they don't want in their class, depending on how they feel that day. So they make a excuse to get them out. But then when those same teachers are out sharing these statements that are being said in the chat, we understand why.
Yeah, so actually, I think this is one of my equity champions from Durham, talked about one of the first things I've started doing, especially if it's harmful or offensive, I will interrupt and start immediately asking questions about the motivation behind their comments. And a lot of people are talking about a strategy for responding in a healthy way is getting comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations. And essentially that's what we're trying to get at here. Like it's not easy to walk away because it sticks with you. It will weigh on you. And I know there were times where I did not speak up the way I should have. And those are some of my biggest regrets from my times in the classroom and working with my peers and my colleagues. And so, but I think after going home a few times and realizing that I was silent when I should have spoken up, at some point you realize I have to say something. And the easiest way kind of goes back to a comment that was made about asking a question. Sometimes if we can just ask a follow-up question when someone has said something problematic, it can be very helpful in navigating these situations. So I'm about to advance to the next slide. Mr. Porter, anything else before I move on?
I was just going to say that some people that are here with us today might be like me. So I like my pancakes hot. So I like to deal with it right then, because sometimes people, and you'll get to this in a second, whenever you're asking the question, they may not even realize what they said to you. So when you actually say it out loud to them or question them, they're like, did I say that? Yeah, you did, right? So oftentimes, I believe that whenever you allow certain time lapse, when you come back, people will liable to say, oh, no, I didn't say that. Oh, I couldn't have said that, right? So definitely timing is important. Someone mentioned in the chat in reference to that relationship piece, whenever you're confronted is important, and that is true. And I said that earlier as well, but Dr. Bullock, you can go ahead and proceed as you were going to.
So one of the strategies that we've been sharing in our district in empowering educators to, and this isn't about trying to start arguments with people or anything like that, but it is about challenging each other to be reflective of the language that we're using, how we're talking about our students, et cetera. So Teaching Tolerance produced this publication called Speak Up. And in it, they provide 4 strategies for addressing implicit bias. And so those 4 strategies are to interrupt, question, educate, and echo. And just to briefly go over each, interrupt, when we're talking about interrupting, if we feel someone kind of going down a rabbit hole of biased statements, we can ask people to just pause. And the easiest way to get someone to pause is often by using number 2, asking a question. So if something has been said that's problematic, back to Porter's point about pancakes while they're hot, what did you mean by the statement when you said, etc.? So just prompting a person to either repeat what they said or to, provide more clarity around what was said. sometimes as soon as you ask that question, people realize what they have said was problematic. Or we also ask the question sincerely because we may be asking a question because we genuinely did not understand what was said. And it may be that what we heard was not what was really communicated. So I have to own that. Sometimes I think it was something a little weird about what was said, but in the end, it wasn't. And so I can own that. So, but asking the question just prompts one to reflect, and it creates further clarity around what's being said. Now, in times where we find out that what was said was indeed problematic, if we have resources accessible, Teaching Tolerance is a great place to find good resources. We may need to educate people around why what they said was problematic. So a conversation that we often have to have is about access to advanced academics. And sometimes when we're pushing for more diversity in advanced academic opportunities, some people feel like we're inherently lowering the bar or lowering the standards for that. But what we've seen is that typically Black and Latino students who meet the qualifications to get advanced academic opportunities actually do not get those opportunities at the same rates that white students do. So educating people about that reality, because people will say, you know, people may combat on that issue or have these comebacks on issues like that and say that, well, those students aren't qualified, et cetera. But no, actually, research shows that students that do meet the qualifications often don't get the opportunities due to our racial biases. And the fourth strategy is echoing, meaning, you know, it is difficult when you might be the lone voice in a school trying to advocate for equity. So as much as we can, if you see someone else, if you are not that person that's always advocating for equity, but you know teacher A is, then one of the things we can do is echo or support the teachers that are. And then once we realize that it's not just one person advocating for these things, but it grows into a team of people, then you start to change the culture and climate that students are operating in, and even our peers and our colleagues are operating in. Yeah. Mr. Porter, anything?
Yeah, Dr. Bullock, I liken it to the slot machine, right? I don't know how many people have been to Vegas. You know, it doesn't matter if it's a penny slot or the dollar slot or quarter slot. All slot machines are the same, but that's what a lot of people do. They go and they just keep going to the slot machine that they feel as though going to give them some money. And they do that whenever they're talking to colleagues. So whenever you're building that coalition or you're building these people, they go, well, I know I can go and talk to this person about it. Well, if you start going, interrupting them and questioning, and educating, and echoing, then they're not going to talk to you. They're going to go somewhere else. They can't do it. They're going to go somewhere else, right? So they keep going to see who is going to actually engage. But if you're going to change the culture of your school and the culture of, if we're going to change the culture of schools, the culture of districts, and the culture of our state, then we have to make sure that we are all doing this work so that those people who are wanting to say these comments doesn't have anyone to go to.
All right. My apologies, monitoring the chat, and people are sharing about how, you know, sometimes you can be in a lonely place trying to challenge some of these ideas. And that is a reality sometimes initially, but I can tell you that over time, as we speak up and speak out, you know, other people, other like-minded people will start to gravitate towards that, and they will want to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. I encourage you all, if you're a teacher, to work with your administrator. If you're seeing some things that you have some concerns about, you know, build some camaraderie around this issue of equity and making sure that our practices are yielding the best outcomes for students. So, Mr. Porter, I'll yield to you here, and we'll provide some quick points of advice about how we address issues of equity and bring, you know, more equity to some of our discipline practices and beyond.
Our time is going by so fast, so quickly. So, excuse me, to address issues of equity, the work must be three things: intentional, collaborative, and inspired. And we're going to share with you some of the things that we've done in our district when it comes down to these three things. So the first one is intentional. In our district, we in our strategic plan, we specifically called out our disproportionalities when it comes down to discipline. We talk about academics as well, but specifically on discipline, we say that we're going to create cultural frameworks. Right now, we're using restorative practices, capturing kids' hearts, or PBIS, which is moved to MTSS. But also, our office specifically has been intentional on trying to engage our students and teach and empower and give resources to our teachers, but specifically for being intentional, we've created a We Are Kings Boys of Color program. And this is a program that I lead throughout the district at all of our schools that decided they want to have one there. It's funded through our office, where we want to empower our young men to be leaders. This particular year, we took all of our students to the International Civil Rights Center so that they understand the struggle and things that they've been through. We also were intentional about creating a barbershop talk series where we invited all of our stakeholders to have candid conversations about the issues that we were having in our district. We had 3 barbershop talk series. The first one we had our school and district leaders. The picture that you see is our second one. We found it very important and very difficult for you to have conversations about students, but don't involve students in the conversation. So we decided that we'd have our students on one of our barbershop talk panels. The students were very empowered. One of the things that our students shared with us is they feel as though they walk around with a target on their back simply because of the color of their skin. So not only does it need to be intentional, but it also needs to be collaborative. Dr. Bullock.
And I'll speak briefly to this. So the Office of Equity, our Office of Equity Affairs started in 2017. I was in office of one until July of 2018 when Mr. Porter came on board. So one of the things that I knew was going to be very important from the jump was I was going to have to collaborate with others to see this work really come to fruition. And so, and I encourage you all to do the same. Equity cannot be, so we're a district of about 33,000 students. Equity cannot be the work of 2 people in a district of our size. We have to have some collective ownership over this work. And so what you see on this slide are just, some of the different groups. In the slide, you'll see like in the top left, that's a group of teachers. We were working on African-American studies curriculum. Top right is one of my friends who's a principal in Wake County Schools. So just working with stakeholders from different places is going to be vital. We have professors on this slide, administrators, we work with a number of different groups to try to make this work come to life.
But ultimately, our work must be inspired. I'm a firm believer that if our presence doesn't make a difference, our absence won't matter. And we have to find a way to be inspired to continue to do this work. You wouldn't be at this conference if equity wasn't important to you. You wouldn't be at this conference if you weren't inspired by these students or by your students and by your teachers. But we have to find a way to motivate us and to inspire us, because our future is very important. And we can't wait on the next person to decide to take the lead. We need to go ahead and show our students how to lead.
Porter, I want to, and I'm going to ask you to speak briefly to this. So the bottom right-hand corner of this slide are the young men who are part of our barbershop talk. So represented on that panel, we have, I think, a young man who's currently at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And we also have someone who's enrolled at Harvard currently. But we tried to make sure we had a diverse panel with some diverse experiences in schools. So can you speak a little bit about the diversity that was represented in that panel and the need to hear from students with different types of experiences?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when people say we want to center student voices, We typically only tend to center those student leaders who are doing well. And I wanted to make sure that when we have conversations with our students, that we had a broad range of students who were struggling at the time we had the Barbershop Talk series, students who struggled and then turned around, students who were doing well, students who were in the middle of the road in between. Ironically, with our students, when I was going to meet the students and give them their shirts, one of the students was skipping. And I said, I'm coming to get this student. They're like, well, they called him on the walk. Yeah, we just saw him skipping. So it's important for us to understand that we have to engage all of our students, not just those students who are in SGA, but we need to find those students. I often say there's a difference between power and influence. If you can get the students who have the influence, then you'll be able to make changes and actually inspire those students. So with our Barbershop Talk series and having these wonderful students, these students had influence in their schools. This young man who's going to Harvard, he plays football, but he went on an academic scholarship. Another man who went to the best school in the nation, North Carolina A&T State University, is doing amazing. Another student, he decided he wanted to go into trade. But I just believe that we have to empower our students to do well. And as educators, we cannot allow adultisms to take over. And we feel as though we know everything for them, because we can't teach this generation of students the same way we were taught.
Yeah, and I just know sometimes when we start talking about student voice, and there are only certain types of students we want to hear from. And who we really need to hear from, honestly, are the students that are having the most troubling experiences in our schools. So thank you, Mr. Porter, for that. Emmy?
Yes, thank you both so much for this fantastic presentation that you have provided for us today. You've given us quite a bit of information to reflect upon as we continue to move forward with finding that educational equity that is needed across all schools. For our participants today, we do offer the opportunity for a certificate of attendance. I'm going to post an evaluation link into the chat multiple times. It's an opportunity not only for you to ask for that certificate, but to also reflect on your thoughts of today's session. Dr. Bullock has also provided on screen a QR code where you can snap that. But again, we want to certainly hear from you today. Again, thank you all so much for your participation. I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Bullock and Mr. Porter for some final thoughts.
All right, so I'll try to do these as quickly as possible.
And Dr. Bullock, before you get started on this slide, if we could do the one word in the chat, that would be great. So if you could, because our time is running out. And we're real short on. If you could, please, ma'am, please, sir, please put in the chat one word to describe how you feel or your thoughts on today's presentation as we are concluding. And if you guys, our information will be on one of the last slides for you to, if you have any comments you want to put on social media for that information as well.
All right, so you're looking at the time. All right, so a few things that schools and districts can do. And I do want to acknowledge, because I noticed someone mentioned, there have been comments in the chat, a number of comments about EC or students who receive EC services, students from our LGBTQ community. One of the things that we really want people to consider with this equity work is the students that are having the most troubling outcomes, which oftentimes are our Black males, our Latino males. But also, I mean, if we look at in our district, if we look at our discipline data, right behind Black boys, as far as suspensions go, are Black girls, which is also a reason why I put push out on this list as a potential book club recommendation. But I say just monitor the data, monitor the numbers, but monitor the experiences. When we have parents communicate to us in ways that they don't feel that they are a part of the school community, how do we troubleshoot that? Not just to say the parents don't care, but what can we do to create an environment, a culture in which they feel welcome, they feel like their presence is wanted. So just wanted to acknowledge that, and thank you all for what you've been sharing in the chat and as you continue. So some things that schools and districts can do. We are fans of books and reading and doing some research around these types of issues. There is a lot of great literature out there that can help you in this process. So we encourage book clubs. We did a district-wide book club on the book Despite the Best Intentions last year, which and the subtitle of that is How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools. So despite our best intentions, I'm not saying anyone here has been totally dedicated to manifesting racism in their practices, but despite our intentions to not do that, that is what has happened. So that's a good book to think about. How does this actually manifest in schools and how can we stop it? Push Out by Monique Morris talks about the criminalization of Black girls in schools, which are often forgot about population when it comes to discipline disparities. Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. We've done a small book study on that, and it has some really good ideas. Angela Valenzuela's work, the work that I've noted here is a little older, but it speaks about the experiences of Mexican-American immigrants, or excuse me, I think Mexican Americans in Texas and their experiences in trying to create a more culturally responsive environment there for them. We also encourage you to create and research practices designed to address inequities. Perform a root cause analysis. Don't just look at the data and leave it there on the surface, but really understand what is creating the disparities. Is it the fact that we have differing definitions of disrespect, or differing definitions of disruptive behavior, differing definitions of insubordination, which is a loaded term in itself? So having those types of conversations as a staff can help you to be more equitable and fair in your practices. I encourage districts to look into developing an equity policy. That's something we're doing, and expanding professional learning on topics of equity as much as possible. I also think that's a really good idea. So we say questions, but we do have a couple of minutes. Porter, I'm going to put our contact information up here. Porter, anything you'd like to say as we close?
I just appreciate everyone taking the time to join our session today. Any questions that you guys have for Dr. Bullock or myself, if you want to reach out to us, Dr. Bullock's email is on the screen at daniel.bullock@dpsnc.net. Its Twitter handle is @DPS_equity. I'm Jermaine L. Porter. I'm the Boys of Color Initiative Coordinator, and my email address is jermaine.porter@dpsnc.net. You can, and my Twitter is @Jermaine L. Porter.
The book was Despite the Best Intentions by Amanda Lewis and John Diamond. So sorry, that's something that was in the chat. I think this session is being recorded, and there should be something that you could watch later. So someone was asking about that.
Emmy might be able to answer that particular question for us. Emmy, if you're there.
Yes, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our Friday Institute site for the conference. So you will be receiving further information about that later.
All right. Yeah, so
I think it's 11:15.
All right. And Porter always gets on me because I talk too much and we always run over on time, but we actually ended on time. So I did a great job. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you both so much. We thoroughly enjoyed your presentation today, and we look forward to the work that continues to happen across our state.
Thank you.
All right. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good one.
Have a great one.